الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Imam Nasafi's Kanz al-Daqa'iq, we have reached the lesson on water, wells and leftover water. Briefly, in the previous lessons, we've looked at purification with wudu and ghusl, right? And there are many points, and it'd be important to revise those. And we also touched very briefly on the notion of spiritual purification as well. And we've also touched upon that it's important, in order to give the fiqh its due, that as we go through the text, and this is upon the student of knowledge, that one read the related hadith on the virtues of wudu, on the description of the prophetic wudu, the description of the prophetic ghusl, etc. So we looked at these, and it's good. Just one should, ask oneself: have I reviewed what I've covered so far? Right? That's a question that one should take seriously. So water. Now, water is the means to make wudu, right? So it has serious, and we know that water can be rendered filthy. So what can one make wudu with? This is significant question. Used to be of particular concern when water was more difficult to access. Like, taps were not a default, right? And people would be outside a lot more. And we shouldn't take these things for granted, number one. And number two, all kinds of scenarios arise where the cleanliness of the water may be threatened. You go camping, you get stuck outside the house. Can I make wudu with this or not? So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned water as being one of the greatest blessings in the Quran, and we need to be aware of that and appreciate that. Water has been made purifying by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? He has sent down water from the heavens, لِيُطَهِّرَكُمْ بِهِ, in order to purify you with it. So the nature of water is that it's purifying, right? In its natural state. That's number one. Number two, it's an important principle to appreciate that purification, tahara, is understood to be a condition. It's of our duties of worship, but it's a ibadat wasail. It's an act of worship that is a means to the ibadah al-maqsuda, to the deliberate acts of worship, which in this case is the salah. So we will see the implications of this when it comes to the removal of filth. So water in its natural state can be used for purification, because that's what it was created for. However, there are things that compromise the state of purity of that compromise the water. What compromises the water, if it mixes with it, could be pure or could be filthy, right? If something pure mixes with water, we know that slight change is excused. Slight change to the quality of the water is difficult to avoid, and it's excused. And it goes under a broad principle in the Sharia, which is that which is difficult to avoid is typically excused. وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ, right? So if the water was slightly muddy, was slightly murky, had a little bit of residual taste because of the pot it's in, whatever. Slight changes. So what mixes with the water, if it's pure, there could be slight change, but then there's major change. And we'll look at that. Or what mixes with the water could be filthy. And then we consider whether it's a small body of water or a large body of water. And each has its requisite rulings, as we will see بإذن الله تعالى.
Excuse me, Sheikh.
Yes.
We were at
Okay.
the Mujibat of Ghusl.
We'll finish that off after this class. Okay, so we'll finish this and we'll do that after. So he tells us rahimahullah ta'ala ويتوضأ بماء السماء والعين والبحر وإن غير طاهر أحد أوصافه أو أنتن بالمكث. Right? Wudu can be performed with water. Right? Whether from rainfall, بماء السماء, water from the sky. ماء السماء is, this idafa is of min. Right? من السماء, and water from the sky is rainwater, right? From rainfall or from springs, whether it comes down from the sky, comes up from the ground, or wells, bi'r, or from the sea. But technically al-bahr would include or large bodies of water, because bahr in the classical sense, broad classical sense, refers to a large body of water. It's not a condition that it be a sea, but generally it's used for a sea, right? So here, this goes back to the issue of what is unconditional water, right? Right? Unconditional water. The author doesn't give us a definition of unconditional water, but what is unconditional water? Is that which you would call water without having to give it a condition. هو ما يتبادر عند الإطلاق بقولنا ماء. What comes to mind when you say water? Right? وَلَمْ يَقُمْ بِهِ خَبَث, and it wasn't affected by خبث, by filth. وَلَا مَعْنَى يَمْنَعُ جَوَازَ الصَّلَاةِ, and nothing affected it of the things that do no longer permit its use with respect to prayer. So that's unconditional water. It's what would you call water, الماء المطلق, right? And the biggest thing is unaffected by filth. It wasn't used. It's not been used. So it's not rendered filthy. It's not rendered used, and it's not considered conditioned. So unconditioned water was not rendered filthy, was not rendered used, and it's not become conditioned. Right? That it mixed with something pure such that you can no longer call it water. Right? Such as tea. Tea is largely water. But you put enough tea leaves in it, even if you leave it overnight, cold brewed tea. Yeah, a liter of water, if you put 1 spoon of tea, right? Weigh 1 liter, 1 kilo in weight of water, and 2 spoons of tea. How much does 2 spoons of tea weigh? About 12 grams or less, 10 to 12 grams, depending on the size of the spoon. Right? But in 24 hours, you'd call that iced tea. You wouldn't call it water, right? So that's unconditional water. Not filthy, not used, not conditioned. These sources are mentioned تعدادا, right? Just to list the sources of water, and تذكيرا, as a reminder of blessings. Number 3, that regardless of source, right? Regardless of source, right? وَإِنْ غَيَّرَ طَاهِرٌ أَحَدَ أَوْصَافِهِ, even if something pure changes one of its qualities. And this is referring to slight change, right? This is referring to slight change, right? Right? Even if something pure changes some of its qualities, and the biggest criteria is that can you still call it water? صحة إطلاق اسم الماء. And we'll see that changes to water could be major or minor, right? Right? Water that just changes its quality just by being still for a long time, so it starts smelling, changes color, etc. طول المكث, it may not be drinkable for some reason or the other, but just طول المكث, long-standing, does not make it filthy, right? Imam al-Nasafi does not break this down. So till the 7th century and beyond, the ulama had a number of principles related to distinguishing between minor and major changes to water, like if something falls into the water. And they address the issues one by one, right? And basically, can you still call it water? So they address the things one by one. And one of the reasons is because making general statements is generally wrong, right? You're usually wrong, right? So fuqaha are very careful. They only generalize when it's generalizable, right? So here, I was tempted to share the diagram with you, but you can diagram this. So we said water, so we'll address filth later, but if something pure mixes with water, that which mixes with water was the underlying criteria is this change minor or is this change major? And a sign of it being major change was, would you still call it water? And then they addressed the individual cases one by one. Imam Nasafi mentioned some of them here. One of the commentators on the Kanz, Imam al-Zayla'i, in Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, he put down a dabit that gathered a criterion, that gathered the issues related to this, which is the following: that something pure, if it mixes with water, could be solid or liquid. If something solid mixes with water, we're talking about the pure, right? If something solid mixes with water, then it remains purifying as long as it retains إن بقي الماء على طبعه. if the water retains its طبع, its nature. And its طبع is رقة وسيلان, that it's subtle and flowing. Number one. وصح استطلاق اسم الماء عليه, and you can still call it water. Because most solids don't affect the water the way liquids affect water, because liquids mix, right? So anyways, that's the criteria there. A major change to water, if a solid falls in it, is the water thickens. And you can no longer call it water. And if a liquid mixes with water, then what counts is تغيير الأوصاف, the attributes of water changing. So if what predominates are the attributes of what mixed with the water, so you mixed pomegranate juice and water, right? It's بظهور الأوصاف, such that the attributes predominate. So that's basically, and in both cases, there's an underlying issue of, you can still call it water, which takes care of things like tea, because tea is a solid. Tea leaves are a solid. They mix with water. The water retains its طبع, which is رقة and سيلان. Tea is also subtle and flowing. Why can't you make wudu with cold tea? Because you can no longer call it water. Okay. So, Imam he says, لا بماء تغير بكثرة الأوراق. It's not valid, i.e. wudu is not valid with a لا يتوضأ بماء تغير بكثرة الأوراق. One cannot make wudu with water that changed due to a lot of leaves falling into it. بكثرة الأوراق أي بوقوعها, by them falling into it. Right? In Al-Bahr Al-Ra'iq, Mawlana Ibn Nujaym explains that this fara, like that water changed with leaves. Now if we apply the principle that we mentioned, if a leaf falls into water, the taghir, the water changes. So eucalyptus leaves fall into the water. The water changes in its color, becomes green. Its smell and its taste. Can you still make wudu with it? Yes. This is understood. Imam, the author of Al-Bahr says, هذا محمول على ما إذا زال عنه اسم الماء. If you can no longer call it water. If the water changed by a lot of leaves falling in it, this is if it can no longer be called water. Like in the case of tea, for example. Right? So many leaves fell into the water that it became something else. Now you call it eucalyptus juice. Or the simple example, tea. Right? Enough water, liquid, enough, it fell in it, it changed it, so you can no longer call it tea. Or it became thick. It became thick so that it no longer resembles water. So you can, but in both cases, you can no longer call it water. Okay, so that's أو بالطبخ, or if water changes due to cooking. It was cooked with something, such that even if it's slight, such that you could no longer call it water anymore. It became curry or sauce or, so it changed. تغير بالطبخ. It changed by cooking, again, such that you could no longer call it water, right? Or due to cooking. أو اعتصر من شجر أو ثمر, or it was extracted from trees or fruit, right? So there's some tree and we squeeze this water out of it, right? So we made gashes in this tree and a liquid comes out, right? Why? Even ولو كان على أوصاف الماء, even if it has both the طبع of water, the nature of water, and its qualities. Why? Because would most people call it water? Imagine, if we're walking outside, I go to a tree, make some gash and collect some liquid. Would you call that water? Would you? You say, no, this liquid from the tree, right? So the I don't know what you would say, but and there's two aqwal in the madhab about this, right? One is if it came out, the other if it was taken out. But in this, the relied upon position is that if لو اعتصر من شجر أو ثمر, it was extracted from shajar. And of course, shajar in Arabic, what does it refer to? Is anything that grows with a trunk. So it's not necessarily a tree. In classical Arabic, right? Right? Aw thamar, and fruit is not necessarily just what fruit is that which plants produce. Right? Right? Now there's an indication here. Right? Right? There's an indication here. Right? That what does the author of the Kanz said? If it was extracted from trees or fruit. So what if clear water came out by itself? What if clear water came out by itself, right? Right? From the tree, liquid flowed out, it looks just like water. If it looks like water, so if we take it out from trees or fruit, it's not water. It's not treated as water legally. If it comes out by itself and it's on the qualities of water, there are two opinions. The Kanz indicates that if it comes out by itself, it would be, and it has both the nature of water and the attributes of water, you could make wudu with it. And that is a sound opinion in the madhab. It was chosen in the Hidayah, it was chosen by Az-Zayla'i, it was chosen in Tanwir al-Absar as well, which is much later, right? And these are significant works. That's why that is a zahir opinion in the madhab. It is an apparent opinion, because they consider that you call it water. But the more apparent opinion, the azhar, is that you cannot make wudu with it. And that you find that in the writings of Imam Shurun Bulali, both his Shurun Bulaliya on the Durar and also in Nur al-Idah and the Maraqi, etc. Right? You should be familiar with that issue. Because it's considered that if the water came out from the tree, like what's the water doing in the tree? Right? And sorry for the example. If you drank 2 liters of water and clear liquid came out of you, would you call it, would anybody call that water? No. Why? Because what happens within you, it goes through certain processes. So even if it came out clear, you wouldn't call it water. Now it goes through a tree, it comes out. Anybody who knows trees would say, would that be water? I said, no, it would have changed because there's processes going on within the tree, right? So anyways, 2 opinions. The stronger one is, وَلَوْ خَرَجَ بِنَفْسِهِ مِنْ غَيْرِ عَصْرٍ. Even if it comes out by itself without being squeezed, the stronger opinion is that if that's the only water you would have, you would make tayammum. That's a stronger opinion. Right? And interestingly, this is very interesting, An-Nasafi himself in the Kafi, this all mentioned in Abu Sa'ud, chose that this opinion that it's not valid. So it's intriguing why he would say this in, indicate this in the Kanz. Okay. So, or that was extracted from trees, so you could add in the relied upon opinion, or even if it came out by itself, according to the sounder opinion. This is the Azhar. Okay. Or the third case is that if it's overcome by something by volume, right? 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 If it changes, if water is overcome by something else, by volume, right? And that's in the case of liquid. That's in the case of liquid that mixes with water. If liquid mixes with water, then we consider firstly if the attributes of the liquid predominate over the attributes of water. Right? So pomegranate juice, fresh pomegranate juice, it has color, smell, and taste, mixes with water. And zuhurul wasf is the attribute is manifest. So it goes closer to dark red rather than being pale like water, clear like water. So just slight change is excused, right? The zuhurul wasf, right? It's clearly manifest, right? The redness of the pomegranate, for example, juice, predominates. So if something has 3 qualities, 2 of them become clearly manifest. Slight change is excused. If there's 2 qualities, 1 predominates. If it has no qualities, then we would estimate what is more, the water or the liquid. Like stale, old vinegar that has neither color, smell, nor taste. You don't have to explain why does the vinegar not have taste. It's just there. Let's say you and I decided to make vinegar. The experiment went wrong. We put enough things, we know this is vinegar. But 6 weeks later, it's lost all color, smell, taste. We mix it with water. How do we know that you can no longer call the thing water? Because we mixed half a liter of water with a liter of vinegar. This is أو غلب عليه غيره بالأجزاء. This is في منقطع الأوصاف, in the thing that does not have qualities. If you want to get this issue down, this is really nicely summarized in Nur al-Idah, like what is mentioned by Mawlana al-Zayla'i. An even better summary and more nuanced is there in in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya. And we should add the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya as a resource to the course. This is very useful. Okay. So that's water being affected. We don't want to go into too much detail about that. Okay. Then before the death in water, he says, وَبِمَاءٍ دَائِمٍ, right? أي وَلَا يَتَوَضَّأ بِمَاءٍ دَائِمٍ, right? And one of the challenging things in the Kanz is that what is something in atf to? And it's good to annotate one's copy. Where there's a la, where there is an allowance. So here, يعني وبماء دائم أي ولا يتوضأ بماء دائم فيه نجس. Right? وإلا يعني إن لم يكن عشرا في عشر. Right? One wudu is also not valid from a body of water into which filth, najis, fell, unless it is 10 by 10, 10 arms lengths by 10 arms lengths, 10 cubits by 10 cubits, about 5 meters by 5 meters, roughly. Right? Right? If it is this size, فَهُوَ كَالْجَارِي. If it is this size, then it is treated like flowing water. Right? Right? So what do we have? In the other copy says, وَإِلَّا فَهُوَ كَالْجَارِي. Right? There's an illa, وَإِلَّا missing here. Yeah. Right? But in bunch of copies, otherwise, right? Meaning if this is the case, if it is 10 by 10, then it is like flowing water. Right? If it's 10 by 10. Depth is not considered. So we know textually that small bodies of water, filth falls in it, they become filthy. Large body of water, it doesn't become filthy. Nothing is textually established that fulfills the evidentiary standard for establishing legal limits with respect to the definition of a large body of water. The Shafi'is took the hadith of al-qullatayn, إذا بلغ الماء قلتين لا يحمل الخبث. But that hadith, that if water reaches 2 qullas, it is not affected by filth, that hadith was not acted upon by the Hanafis nor the Malikis. And the reason being that the hadith is muttarib, right? The hadith itself has many textual variants insofar as it's come qulla and qullatayn and qulal, right? Number one. So there is ittirab, there are problems in its transmission because it's been transmitted with varying wording. But then even if we say, okay, even if we were to account for that, then the second problem is, what is a qulla? A qulla is a varying measure, right? It was a markedly varying, there wasn't a standard qulla in Medina. So that also causes a problem. And then there's other problems with respect to the meaning. That water is used from the surface. Like, do I really care what's going on in the deep depths of the water? No. Right? So we make wudu from the surface. If there's there's a bucket of water, or there's a well, a shallow well. If some blood falls in the water, before the blood sinks, what does it do? It spreads and then diffuses, right? What affects me is that if filth fell, would it reach across the surface of the water? Right? Such that if I'm making, naturally, if filth fell on one side of the water, common sense, I'd want to go to the other side to make wudu, right? Ideally. Would the filth reach me? Right? So there's nothing textually established about, and Imam Abu Hanifa has a principle, al-maqadir la tunsab illa min qibal al-shari'. Limits are only established by the lawgiver. So the basis of the madhab is a large body of water is a large body of water. Simple, right? However, have you often tried to make wudu from pools of water? Wells? So if you went to a well and you saw someone make wudu and they dropped a few drops of blood on one side, would you, by looking at it, be able to say, okay, the blood will come to the other side? I don't know about water. I don't deal with it all the time. I'm not a farmer. I don't live in the countryside. Right? So the transmitted position of the madhab, ظاهر الرواية, and what is soundest theoretically is that الماء الكثير ما يستكثره الناظر. A large body of water is what the onlooker would deem to be a large body of water. And what would they deem? That if the najasa fell on one side, its traces would not have reached the other side. But then they found, the ulama found people have no clue about something like that. So they gave fatwa on defining the surface area, 10 by 10. And they said this is taysiran. So that you tell people 10 by 10, تيسيرا لمن لا رأي له من العوام ودفعا للوسوسة, to facilitate and this has been one of the battlegrounds of khilaf within the madhab, but many of the mutun took this, including the Kens, for practical purposes. There's big back and forth. If you look in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq and many later texts, they disagreed. Tahtawi also disagreed. He said, no, the original position, the madhab, is the stronger position. Mawlana Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi in the Si'aya also says, no, this 10 by 10, it doesn't have Shari'i basis. Ibn Abdin makes a very strong defense of the 10 by 10 position. Says that the A'yan, the foremost of the representative imams of the madhab, gave fatwa on this. And we defer to their judgment. And he quotes these lines of poetry. وَإِذَا لَمْ تَرَ الْهِلَالَ فَسَلِّمْ لِقَوْمٍ رَأَوْهُ بِالْأَبْصَارِ. If you don't see the new moon, then defer to those who've seen it with their own two eyes. And the underlying reason being that ultimately fiqh has to relate to human actions. If we were to go and tell 100 people in that situation. 100 people standing by a pool of water. Say, well, if the najasa wouldn't have reached your side, you can make wudu with it. Just if you imagine 100 people, would the majority of them have clarity on what they're supposed to do next? And can I make wudu or not? No. A large percentage of people would be confused. If it fell on the other side, would its traces reach me? How do I know? Right? So one is theoretically stronger, but practically, that's the fatwa. So it's okay. If it's 10, we would say 5 meters by 5 meters. The water is more than 5 meters by 5 meters, 25 square meters, and you make an estimate. Okay. What's okay? 5 meters. So that's like the length of 2.5 human beings. Say roughly. Or 3 people. Then you can make an estimate. So far fewer people would be confused, right? So and some ulama would explain that 10 by 10 is taqdeer lil kathir. It is an approximative definition of what is kathir. And the khilaf has remained in the madhab. Then he says, وَإِلَّا فَهُوَ كَالْجَارِ. If it's more than 10 by 10, then it is like flowing water. وَهُوَ أي الماء الجاري ما يذهب بتبنة. Right? Flowing water is that which would take away a piece of straw. Flowing is a horizontal concept. If you were to put a small straw on it, straw we mean like straw of hay, not straw like, especially now with these metal straws would just think, would mean like a blade of grass on it, it would go away with it, right? Now again, al-jari, flowing water, in the asl of the Hanafi madhab, al-ma'u al-jari ma yu'addu jariyan. Flowing water is that which would be considered flowing, right? And it's the strongest definition. This mentioned by At-Ta'i, for example, you can see it. They say, and flowing is that it enters from one place and exits from another, right? Right? Even if it didn't have its force. Now there's issues. What if you took a bucket of water and emptied it on top of a slide and collected on the other top of the slide? Would it become tahir? Don't do it, right? And it's unresolved issue. Or there's khilaf in it. Anyways, فَيَتَوَضَّأْ مِنْهُ. So a large body of water, right? Or flowing water, one makes wudu from it, right? إِن لَمْ يُرَى أَثَرُهُ. A large body of water or flowing water, one makes wudu with it, meaning even if filth falls into it, as long as the traces of the filth aren't discernible. What are the traces of the filth? He tells us, وَهُوَ أي الأثر طعم أو لون أو ريح. And it, meaning the trace of filth, is smell, taste, color, and smell. Of course, taste, if you have reasonable doubt that it may be filthy, you cannot deliberately taste it. Right? Now there's a distinction between taste, to be blameworthy, and swallowing, which would be haram. Right? But even swallowing, because you don't put najasa into your mouth and you don't take those kinds of risks, right? Like, you see something, you're not sure, is it vinegar or wine? You look at the color, you look at the smell, but you wouldn't taste it because you wouldn't allow yourself to taste wine, right? Even if you don't swallow. You'd be highly blameworthy to taste it. It'd be haram to swallow it if you realize that it's wine. Allahu Alam. Anyways. Things that don't have flowing blood don't render the water filthy. وموت ما لا دم له فيه كالبق والذباب والزنبور والعقرب والسمك والضفدع والسرطان لا ينجسه. The death of something without flowing blood, such as flies, mosquitoes, wasps, all these kinds of critters, also scorpions, fish, frogs, crabs, doesn't make the water filthy. Right? ما لا دم له سائل, some of the texts mention ما لا نفس له, right? That doesn't have, and some mention ما لا دم له, right? Right? فيه, they say ما لا دم له فيه, that which does not have blood, meaning that does not have flowing blood in it. And large fish that if you cut them have a lot of blood, but they say that blood is different from the blood of land animals. Just as the excrement of fish is treated differently from the excrement of marine animals. Excrement of fish doesn't become rotten and filthy like that of land animals. Okay. So that's death in water, right? So water, if filth falls into water, it could be small, flowing, or large, right? Flowing and large water are considered the same. Large water, there's the khilaf that we've mentioned. Then he tells us about used water. Used water has an issue, right? That sometimes you wonder, what's the big deal about used water? And the challenge with used water would be, sometimes we take our blessings for granted, that when there is limited water, can I reuse the water? Someone's traveling in the desert, so they make wudu from one bowl. Could you make wudu from the bowl, let it drip onto another bowl, and then you reuse it another time? That's one consideration. Can I reuse the water for another wudu? The other issue is, if you look at the hadiths on wudu. That's why it's so important to read hadith, right? That it's come in the hadith, إِذَا تَوَضَّأَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَأَحْسَنَ الْوُضُوء. So one of you makes wudu and does so well, خَرَجَتْ خَطَايَاهُ. That through making wudu, your sins leave you, حَتَّى تَخْرُجْ مِنْ تَحْتِ أَظَافِرِهِ, until they leave from even under their nails. Meaning, this is how complete an expiatory act the wudu can be. The condition is إِذَا أَحْسَنَ الْوُضُوء, if one does so well. Of course, in terms of doing wudu well, this would entail paying attention to our wudu, right? And treating it as a devotional act, right? And treating it as a devotional act. How? With intention, inwardly with intention and presence of heart. Outwardly, by fulfilling the sunan and adab and being in a state of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during one's wudu. These are the 4 keys to making wudu well, right? Inwardly with intention and presence of heart during the wudu. Outwardly, doing it in accordance with the sunnah, in a state of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with one's tongue, and without wasting water, right? Without wasting water. But wudu has this expiatory role. So if the water removes sin, sin is vile. Sin is vile. That's why the worst of sin is disbelief. And what have polytheists been referred to in the Quran as? Najas. The mushrikeen have been referred to as najas. Are they filthy? They could be the cleanest people around. What is filthy about them is their disbelief. Now, if disbelief is like major filth, sins are like minor filth. But the answer is no. That filth is metaphorical filth, it's not literal filth. Filth is is al-aynul mustaqdaratu shar'an. So that's where the issue arises from. Now, in this issue of used water, there is a narration from Imam Abu Hanifa, and you can find it in the texts discussed, that it's narrated from Imam Abu Hanifa that used water is filthy. And there's even some colorful narrations one of the great Imams of Tasawwuf, this mentioned actually by Shaykh Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani from his teacher, Sidi Ali al-Khawwas, that Imam Abu Hanifa was of the Abdal or Aqtab, or the Abdal or Aqtab, and he could see the sins leaving the water and could see their vileness. Allahu Alam, Imam al-Sha'rani came 8 centuries after Imam Abu Hanifa, so, qila, that doesn't establish a legal anything. But either way, what's significant is that narration of the filthiness of used water is shadh, right? It's shadh from Imam Abu Hanifa, and it does not it is not of consequence. It's shadh, it's not even something used for avoiding difference of opinion, right? Okay. So, al-ma'u al-musta'mal, right? So Imam al-Nasafi frequently defines things in his expressions without pausing to say, this is the definition and this is the ruling. He puts it all together. That's part of brevity. You could break this down into 2. Use water is this, its ruling is such and such, right? But he puts the 2 things together. He says, وَالْمَاءُ الْمُسْتَعْمَلُ لِقُرْبَةٍ أَوْ رَفْعِ حَدَثٍ إِذَا اسْتَقَرَّ فِي مَكَانٍ طَاهِرٌ لَا مُطَهِّرٌ. So used water is pure but not purifying, right? Used water, ماء مستعمل, used for an act of worship or for lifting a state of impurity. If it remains in place even for a moment, is pure but not purifying. Okay, so firstly, so used water was used for a qurba, right? A qurba is any act of devotion, which would be like al-wudu' ala al-wudu' biniyatihi, right? Like making a second wudu'. You're on wudu', but you want to make wudu' for each prayer, right? So you could have the use of water could have both intentions, one, the other, or none. How? You have wudu, you intend wudu again, this is qurba. There's no rafa hadath, there's no lifting of ritual impurity, right? Or you could just, someone woke up, they washed their face, they rinsed their arms, they said, my hair looks like a mess, they fixed their head, and said, my feet stink. Astaghfirullah. They slept in the same smelly socks as the night before because it's cold. So they washed their feet. They had no idea of wudu. This is rafa hadath, right? So you could have both qurba, it could be an act of devotion and lifting ritual impurity, or you could have qurba without lifting ritual impurity because there's none there, or you could have lifting ritual impurity without qurba. You know, someone's wife prepared a bathtub because she wants you to take a bath, but you wanted to pray Salat al-Duha. So she used to do high school wrestling, so she wrestled you into the bathtub, you fell in, you got all wet, you come out, you say Allahu Akbar, you start praying, right? So you could have rafa hadath without qurba. You hadn't intended it. You got thrown into the water, right? So some water that was used for, and there's a situation where none of this happens. You have wudu and you just washed your face. The water that falls off from there, did you intend a qurba, an act of devotion? No. Did it lift ritual impurity? No, because you didn't make wudu. From the qurba, however, is غسل اليد للطعام ومنه. That is mentioned by At-Ta'i, right? Right? And maybe mentioned by others as well, right? Washing your hands before eating, the leftover water from that is used if you intended it, right? That's a qurba, right? Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to wash hands before eating and likewise after eating. If you wash your hands, the leftover water from that is used. Okay. Some of the texts mention a third thing, which is أو إسقاط فرض, or to lift a fard, and you can look at the explanation of that if you'd like to. But then the author says, what is the condition for it being used? إذا استقر في مكان, if it remains in place, right? Right? So this is the issue. Let's say we poured water over a limb. If water touched my limb and just came straight off, has it been used, or does it have to stay on the limb for a little bit to be used before قبل الانفصال, right? So this opinion is, and it's a sound opinion in the madhab, is that it has to stay on your limb for a little bit, because that's when it became used for purification. But even though the author of Tanwir al-Absar, Imam al-Tumurtashi, which Hashid ibn Abdin's with the Durr al-Mukhtar and the Hasha written on, follows the Tanwir very closely, he changed the expression here. Right? And the sounder opinion, the asah in the madhab is إذا انفصل عن عضو وإن لم يستقر. If it separates from the limb, إذا انفصل عن العضو وإن لم يستقر, even if it didn't remain on the limb for even for a moment, right? That's a sounder opinion. So you should note that here, right? This, if it remained in place, it remained on the limb even for a moment. The stronger opinion, when it separates from the limb, it becomes used, even if it didn't remain on the limb. In the Durr it says على المذهب, this is the madhab. على المذهب أي الأصح, right? On the sounder opinion. Right? And it is طاهر طاهر غير مطهر. طاهر لا مطهر. It's pure في نفسه. Right? So if it comes on your clothes, etc., clothes are pure. Tahir, you could use it to remove najasa. But لا مطهر, i.e. لا يرفع به الحدث. You cannot lift ritual impurity from it. لا مطهر. So طاهر فيرفع الخبث, لا مطهر فلا يرفع الحدث. It's طاهر in itself, so you can use it to remove the najis, but it's not mutahhir, it's not purifying, so it does not lift ritual impurity. And interestingly, in the Kafi, Imam Nasafi is reported, I'm quoting from the Kafi, here even in Mulla Miskin he mentions this, that وَفِي الْكَافِي, right, the Kafi of An-Nasafi himself, that it's considered used when it separates from the body. Right? And that's the and that's a position of the generality of the scholars and the stronger opinion, as Mulla Miskin mentions as well. Right? And you could diagram, because something could remain on the limb. While it's on the limb, it remains pure, even if it hasn't separated. And you could break it down a little bit, but that's beyond our scope. Then he says something very interesting. He says, Mas'alatul bihr jihط. The issue of the bi'r, of the well, can be summarized as jihط. Right? And this is summary. Junub, and this is, the jim is for junub, ha is for ala halihi, ta is tahir. Right? And because there are, if someone wants to diagram the issue is a non-issue because the relied upon position, because it's, what if someone falls into a well and comes out? Someone junub falls into a well. Right? Does the water become used? Does it become najis? And then for tahara, Abu Yusuf considered qasd. And there's a number of underlying issues, but the relied upon position is that used water is pure. So the person is not najis. The janaba would be lifted, and they're tahir. Right? And they're tahir. The janaba has been lifted. So the masala al-bi'r, right, which is if a junub went into a well, for example, to find, they went down into the well to find the bucket, and they fell into the well. What's the ruling of the person, the water, etc.? Right? So jim is najasa. Right? Right? So what is the ruling of the man and what's the ruling of the water? So jim is that both the water and the man would be najis. The ha is ala halihima. Both are as they are. Right? So the man remains junub and the water remains tahir according to Abu Yusuf. And ta is from tahara, which is that the man is tahir because he just went into the water, made janaba, and the water remains tahir. But this is a non-issue, because the relied upon position is, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, used water is not filthy. So the water that was used for, if this junub person, the person who required ghusl, went into water, the water, though it became used, it doesn't become filthy, So he comes out pure and the water is pure. So it is a non-issue, but this is just as a mental test that there is that other riwayah. Why is it mentioned? The other riwayah is mentioned to avoid, one, an intellectual exercise, number two, to be aware that minimize getting used water on yourself. That's it. That's the issue of the well. You don't have to pay too much attention to it if you want to take notes on it. But it's not the relied upon transmission, right? Simple as that. And then he looks at tanning and wells. Today we started late, so we're going to stop here. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Inshallah, we missed a section. We will be recording it and sharing it with you. And my apologies for missing that. Alhamdulillah. Any questions before we close?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Two questions actually. Does adding salt to water change its nature?
No, so salt, assuming the salt is a solid, right? Solid salt, if it's added to water, if a solid mixes with water, then what is the criteria? The nature of water is riqqa wa saylan, that it be subtle and flowing. Would salt change? The riqqa, it has the subtlety, the thinness, so to speak, of water? No. Putting salt doesn't turn it like honey-like texture, right? As long as you can still call it water, you can put a lot of salt in water and still call it water, right?
So wudu can be made with salty water?
Of course, yeah. And that's come in the hadith, even seawater. This person asked about the Prophet ﷺ about seawater. So the Prophet ﷺ was asked one thing, he gave two rulings. He says, هُوَ الطَّهُورُ مَاؤُهُ الْحِلُّ مَيْتَتُهُ. Its water is purifying, and what dies in it is halal. And this is mentioned in several works of hadith as being an example of, the alim may be asked about one matter, but may answer with other things that the person would benefit from. Because they just ask, can we make wudu with seawater? Well, when traveling by sea, because they only carry limited amount of drinking water. So they asked about one question, but the Prophet ﷺ told them also about, right? Because so it also has the idea of nush, having nasiha for the other person, seeking their good. Also ri'ayat hal al-mutakallim. Because the ulama said that it would appear that they had knowledge but limited. Right? Because they had enough knowledge, they'd realize that seawater was also water. They had limited knowledge. If you had limited knowledge, then you might come to wrong conclusions. Because then you hear that you can't eat things that are not slaughtered. Oh, fish is not slaughtered. You can't eat it. Right? So he clarified that for them. Also tells you about potential harms of not having knowledge that it causes. I mean, there's many, many lessons in the hadith. So yes, water that has salt. Some people get this issue about chlorine. That's a real issue. That chlorine comes into it. Sometimes you get powdered chlorine that they put in water, for swimming pools and stuff. Sometimes they use liquid chlorine. And sometimes, because it's like blue colored. So they put so much that actually changes the color of the water slightly. So chlorine, let's say it's liquid chlorine. Does it have color? Yes, blue. Does it have smell? Yeah, it's got that tangy swimming pool smell. Does it have taste? Yeah, it has taste. Although be careful, in a public swimming pool you may be tasting other things. There's actually estimated percentages of what percentage of people actually urinate in swimming pools. It's quite shocking actually. You may want to assess swimming pool policies if you are responsible for halal swimming pools. Or at least go to big swimming pools, right? Because small swimming pools that are not 10 by 10 may not be wise places for a person to go. At least take a shower afterwards. Anyways, liquid chlorine, right? That the fatwa is that it's water. Would anyone say that the thing in the swimming pool is not water? No. That's why the governing consideration is this change slight or major. And secondly, yes, chlorine changes the color of the water, but is it zuhurul wasf? Is the blue of the chlorine predominant over the clearness of the water? No. Is the taste overwhelming? Does it taste like chlorine? Is it water and there's hints of chlorine, right? The smell, if you took three things, regular water, no smell. Smell the chlorine itself, really strong smell. And this water of the swimming pool, smelled it, this slight smell, that's not ghalaba, it's not overcome. This is discussed very well by Sheikh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi in Nihayat al-Murad, Sharh Hadiyat ibn Imad. Any other questions before we close?
If there's a small hot tub, for example, and there's two individuals, they're both in a state of ritual impurity. One person enters the hot tub, fully submerges himself, and then he exits. Would he be considered pure now? And if the second person now enters, would he also be pure?
Yeah. Because two things. One is that pure water, used water is pure, number one. But number two, the only water that was used is malaq al-udu, wanfasala anhu, that which came into contact with the limb and separated from it. So if you take a snapshot, when the person went into the water, their body, the water that came in touch with the body, at that moment, that is used. What portion of that's the only used water. The rest of the water is unused. Just as if for a moment we have, let's say and tubs of water are very inefficient. And that's why it's not a sunnah to take a bath, right? In the sense of that which you do in a tub, right? Because it uses a lot of water. If you want to do it, ahlan wa sahlan, but don't make it a habit because you're using a couple hundred liters of water, right? Prophet ﷺ used 2.5 liters, right? Roughly 2.5, 3 liters. So it's only that much, which is what? 10 liters of water. The other 190 liters are unused. So if you mixed used water with unused water, the unused water predominates, so all of it becomes unused. And that's the fatwa position. That's the stronger fiqh-wise. There are other lines of legal reasoning, but they're just complicating.
So I was asking, for the issue of the well, would the well water be no longer usable in wudu?
According to whom? The well issue, this is the jim ha ta is according to that narration of Imam Abu Hanifa, it both would be najis. According to Imam Abu Yusuf, ala halihima, the junub remains junub because they didn't, and we'll see, because he had a condition for ghusl. We don't need to get into that. I don't want to confuse anybody. And according to Imam Muhammad, is tahir, and the narration of Imam Muhammad is actually the position of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. So the junub goes into the well, comes out, and they didn't have any filth on them. They're tahir, they're no longer junub, and the water is طاهر. يعني مسألة البئر we say is هي للمثال but the معتمد is the طاهر. The junub person who went into the well, for example, to pick up the bucket, but they fell into the well, they're tahir, the water is tahir. Because they used, water that's used for wudu or ghusl is pure but not purifying, but the whole water is pure, remains purifying, right? Okay. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So we're going to send you a supplementary lesson bi'idhnillahi ta'ala because we missed part of lesson 4 and we're going to finish off lesson 5. Those of you who can stay on, we're going to do that today in about 20 minutes. So if you wish to stay on in 20 minutes, we can do that. So we'll be delaying the maraqib. So we'll be doing two things. We accidentally missed a part of lesson 4. So we'll finish that off and we'll do part 3 of lesson 5, so we have complete recording. So we'll do that at 5:30 actually. Trauma time.